The 14-year-old boy stood before the settlement council with drawings of a cabin built under a cliff ledge, and every man in the room laughed at what they called a child's fantasy. 6 months later, those same men would arrive at his door in a blizzard, begging for the shelter they had mocked. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Elias Drummond could skin a beaver in under 3 minutes, set a trap line that would catch more game than men twice his age, and track deer through snow so expertly that other hunters asked his father how the boy had learned. He was 14 years old in the winter of 1841, living with his family in a log cabin along the eastern slopes of the Montana Rockies, and he had already spent 6 years learning every skill necessary to survive in the wilderness. His father, Thomas Drummond, had brought the family west from Ohio when Elias was 8, seeking fortune in the declining fur trade and finding instead a hard life that demanded competence from everyone, including children. The Drummond cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine forest, 2 days' ride from the nearest settlement. Thomas worked trap lines along the creek systems that fed into the Yellowstone River. Margaret, Elias's mother, managed the household with the efficiency of someone who understood that mistakes in the wilderness carried consequences. Sarah, Elias's 9-year-old sister, helped with cooking, mending, and the endless tasks required to keep a frontier family fed and clothed. Elias did the work of a man, checking traps, hunting for meat, hauling firewood, and maintaining equipment. The cabin was typical of the region and era. Thomas had built it in 5 days with help from 2 other trappers, using logs cut from the surrounding forest. The structure measured 16 feet by 20 feet, with walls made from pine logs notched at the corners and stacked horizontally. Mud mixed with moss filled the gaps between logs. The roof consisted of smaller logs laid across the walls, covered with bark and a layer of sod. A stone fireplace occupied one corner. 1 door, 2 small windows covered with oiled paper, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder completed the design. Elias had helped his father build that cabin when they first arrived. He remembered notching the logs, mixing the mud for chinking, and hauling rocks for the fireplace. The cabin kept them warm in winter and dry during rain. It had served the family well for 6 years. On the morning of January 12, 1842, Elias woke before dawn. He dressed in the darkness of the loft, pulling on wool pants, a heavy shirt, and the fur-lined jacket his mother had made from beaver pelts. He climbed down the ladder quietly. His parents were already awake. His father was preparing to check the trap lines. His mother was building up the fire for breakfast. Boone, the family's German shepherd, rose from his spot near the fireplace and stretched. Elias pulled on his boots and stepped outside with Boone following. The January air was brutally cold. Snow covered the ground to a depth of 2 feet. More snow was coming. Elias could see it in the gray clouds building to the northwest. His father emerged from the cabin carrying his rifle and a pack. "Check the eastern line," Thomas said. "I'll take the northern traps. We should both be back by afternoon." Elias nodded. They had worked this way for years, dividing the trap lines to cover more territory. He collected his own rifle, checked that his powder was dry, and headed into the forest with Boone ranging ahead. Elias returned to the cabin at 3 in the afternoon with 2 beaver pelts and a rabbit. The eastern trap line had produced decent results despite the cold. Boone trotted beside him, tired but content after the day's work. As they approached the clearing, Elias noticed the sky had darkened considerably. The storm he had sensed that morning was arriving faster than expected. Wind was picking up, bending the tops of the pine trees and sending snow swirling from their branches. His father had not yet returned from the northern line. This was unusual, but not alarming. The northern traps covered more difficult terrain and sometimes took longer to check. Elias entered the cabin where his mother was preparing dinner and Sarah was mending a shirt by the fireplace. He hung his rifle on the pegs near the door and placed the pelts and rabbit on the work table. "Your father?" Margaret asked. "Not back yet," Elias said. "Storm's coming in hard." They ate a simple dinner of cornmeal mush and dried venison. Thomas arrived just as they were finishing, covered in snow and exhausted. He had checked all the northern traps in increasingly difficult conditions as the storm intensified. The wind outside was now howling around the cabin, and snow was falling so heavily that visibility had dropped to almost nothing. "Bad one," Thomas said, warming himself by the fire. "We'll be inside for a few days." The family settled in for the night. This was familiar routine during winter storms. They had supplies, firewood stacked inside, and the cabin was as secure as any structure in the region. Elias climbed to the loft with Sarah around 8 in the evening. The wind screamed outside, shaking the cabin with powerful gusts. Snow found its way through small gaps in the chinking, creating tiny drifts on the floor. But the fire kept the interior warm enough, and the family felt safe. Elias woke to Sarah screaming and the sound of massive cracking. The cabin was collapsing. The roof, weighted down by accumulated snow from hours of heavy snowfall, was giving way. Elias had perhaps 2 seconds to understand what was happening before the center roof logs crashed downward. He grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward the far corner of the loft, where the angle of the collapsing roof created a small protected space. Logs, bark, sod, and tons of snow poured into the cabin below. The collapse lasted perhaps 10 seconds. When it stopped, Elias and Sarah were trapped in a tiny space in the loft corner, pressed against the wall logs. Everything was dark. Snow filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. Elias could hear Sarah crying. He could hear Boone barking frantically from somewhere below. He called for his parents. There was no answer. He called again, louder. Still nothing. Only the wind and the settling creak of broken timber and the desperate barking of their dog. Elias dug through the snow and debris for 3 hours before he reached the main floor. Sarah stayed in the loft space, too frightened to move. Boone had survived, trapped near the fireplace but protected by the stone structure. Elias found his father first, crushed beneath a roof log that had fallen directly onto the sleeping area. His mother was nearby, killed by the same collapse. The center section of the roof had failed catastrophically, dropping tons of weight onto the area where his parents slept. Elias pulled Sarah from the loft. She saw their parents and began sobbing uncontrollably. Elias held her until she stopped shaking, then wrapped her in every blanket he could find. The cabin was destroyed. One wall had partially collapsed from the roof impact. Snow was everywhere. The fire had been extinguished. The temperature inside was barely different from outside. Elias worked methodically despite the shock. He dragged his parents' bodies outside and covered them with canvas from the ruined cabin. He would bury them properly when the storm passed, but now survival was paramount. He salvaged everything useful from the wreckage: food supplies, his father's tools, weapons, ammunition, blankets, cooking equipment, his mother's sewing kit. He piled everything outside the destroyed cabin under a tarp. The storm continued for 2 more days. Elias built a crude lean-to shelter against a large pine tree 50 yards from the cabin ruins, using salvaged logs and canvas. It was barely adequate, but it kept them alive. He managed to start a fire using dry wood he found under the eaves of the collapsed structure. Sarah stayed wrapped in blankets, in shock, barely speaking. Boone lay beside her, providing warmth. When the storm finally passed, Elias buried his parents on a hillside overlooking the clearing. He marked the graves with stones and carved their names into a piece of wood using his father's knife. Sarah stood beside him during the brief ceremony, holding Boone's collar. She was 9 years old and orphaned. Elias was 14 and now responsible for both their lives. That night, sitting by the fire in the inadequate lean-to with his sister sleeping beside him, Elias studied the wreckage of their cabin. The roof had been the failure point. Too much weight, insufficient support, standard construction methods that worked adequately until they catastrophically failed. His father had built it the way everyone built cabins. Quickly, efficiently, using accepted techniques. And it had killed him. Elias realized that night he would never build a cabin with a roof he had to trust. The problem consumed him. Roofs were necessary. They kept out weather, but they also failed. They collapsed under snow weight, they leaked, they required constant maintenance. They were the weakest point of every cabin in the mountains. How could you have shelter without a roof you had to build? The question obsessed him as he sat watching the fire, his parents newly buried, his sister depending on him, and winter still months from ending. Elias and Sarah lived in the lean-to for 3 weeks while he considered their options. They could not survive until spring in such inadequate shelter. Elias needed to build something more substantial, but the thought of constructing another standard cabin, another roof that could fail, paralyzed him. He checked the trap lines his father had established, bringing in just enough pelts to keep them going. The money from those furs would be crucial when he could get to the settlement to trade. During a hunting trip in early February, Elias tracked a deer into unfamiliar terrain about 2 miles northwest of the destroyed cabin. The deer led him through a narrow valley between 2 ridges. Boone ranged ahead, following the scent. The deer eventually escaped, but Elias found himself standing in a remarkable location. A massive rock formation rose from the valley floor, creating a cliff face that extended perhaps 60 feet high. More importantly, the top of the cliff extended outward, creating an overhang that projected 20 feet beyond the base. Elias stood beneath the overhang and looked up. The rock above him was solid granite, weathered by countless centuries but unchanged. The ground beneath the overhang was nearly snow-free despite the recent storm. Snow had fallen beyond the protected area, but directly under the rock projection, the ground showed only light powder that had blown in on the wind. The overhang had shed the storm's accumulation naturally. 4 feet of snow everywhere else, almost nothing here. He studied the formation for an hour. The overhang was not a simple projection. It curved slightly, creating a natural shelter that was deeper in the center than at the edges. The back wall was vertical granite, solid and impenetrable. The floor beneath the overhang was relatively level, sloping gently away from the cliff to provide natural drainage. The opening faced southeast, which would catch morning sun and avoid the worst of the northwest storm winds. Elias had seen animals sheltering under rock overhangs before. Deer, elk, even bears use such natural formations to escape weather. But he had never considered them as potential building sites. Now, standing beneath tons of ancient granite that would never collapse, never leak, never require maintenance, he understood what he was seeing. Nature had already built the perfect roof. It had been here for thousands of years. It would be here for thousands more. He returned to the lean-to and told Sarah about the cliff. She did not understand what he was proposing until he drew it out with a stick in the dirt. A cabin with 3 walls, the cliff face as the back wall, the rock overhang as the roof. Build only what was necessary. Let nature provide what it already had.
"Will it work?" Sarah asked.
"I think so," Elias said. "I think it's the only thing that will." Elias spent the next week visiting the cliff site repeatedly, measuring, studying, planning. He used a length of rope to measure the overhang's dimensions. The protected area was approximately 30 feet wide and 22 feet deep from the cliff face to where the overhang ended. More than enough space for a cabin that would house him and Sarah comfortably. The granite wall behind was solid and vertical, rising 60 feet to the overhang above. No cracks, no signs of instability. The rock had stood there for millennia and showed no indication of movement or danger. He examined the drainage patterns around the site. Spring snowmelt and rain would flow away from the cliff naturally due to the ground's gentle slope. There was no risk of water pooling against the structure. A small creek ran through the valley 50 yards from the cliff, providing water access. The surrounding forest offered abundant timber for construction. The location was more remote than their previous cabin, but that was acceptable. Isolation meant fewer visitors, but also more security. Elias sketched his design using charcoal on a piece of salvaged wood. 3 walls forming a rectangular structure against the cliff face. The back wall would be the granite cliff itself, requiring no construction. The 2 side walls and front wall would be log construction, similar to standard cabin building, but with crucial differences. Since he only needed 3 walls instead of 4, he could use the saved logs to build thicker, stronger walls. The door would be centered in the front wall. Windows would be placed strategically for light and ventilation. The most revolutionary aspect was the roof, or rather, the lack of one he had to build. The rock overhang extended far enough that it would protect the entire structure. No logs to lay, no bark to place, no sod to pile, no weight to collapse under snow, no leaks to repair, no maintenance required. The granite had already solved every problem that roofs presented. Sarah understood the design, but worried about community reaction. They would need help with some aspects of construction. Elias was strong and capable, but hauling logs and raising walls was work that traditionally required multiple men. The nearest settlement was 2 days' travel to the south, where perhaps 15 families lived scattered across the region. Thomas had traded with them regularly, and they knew the Drummond family. Elias decided they would ride to the settlement and request assistance. He would explain what had happened to their parents and present his plan for the new cabin. Surely men who had known his father would help. They packed supplies for the journey and left in mid-February. The trip took 3 days because of Sarah's slower pace and the need to travel carefully with her on the horse behind him. They arrived at Jacob Weatherly's trading post, the central gathering place for the scattered community, on a cold afternoon. Several men were inside when Elias entered with Sarah and explained why they had come. Jacob Weatherly was 42 years old, an experienced trapper who had lived in the mountains for 15 years. He listened to Elias's account of the cabin collapse with appropriate sympathy. Other men gathered as word spread that the Drummond boy was asking for help. Henry Blackwood arrived, a settler who farmed and hunted. William Garrett came from his carpentry work, a man of 51 who considered himself an expert on frontier construction. Elias spread his drawings on the trading post counter and explained his design. 3 walls against a cliff face, the rock overhang serving as a natural roof. Protection without the risk of collapse. As he talked, describing the site and his reasoning, he noticed the men's expressions changing from sympathy to skepticism. Jacob Weatherly examined the drawings for perhaps 30 seconds before pushing them back across the counter toward Elias. "Boy," he said, "I understand you've been through something terrible. Losing your parents like that, it's more than anyone should bear. But this plan of yours, it's not practical. It's not how cabins are built." Elias tried to explain the advantages: the overhang's protection, the saved materials, the elimination of roof collapse risk. Jacob listened but shook his head. "That rock could come down," he said. "How do you know it's stable? It's been there forever, sure, but what if this is the year it decides to fall? You'd be crushed under tons of stone. At least with a regular cabin, if the roof fails, you might survive like you did." Henry Blackwood leaned over the drawings. He was younger than Jacob, perhaps 38, with a family of his own. "Where's the 4th wall?" he asked. "You can't build a cabin with only 3 walls. The structure needs 4 corners for stability. This is basic construction knowledge. Without that 4th corner, the walls will twist and fail. Elias explained that the cliff face would serve as the 4th wall, providing more stability than logs could offer. Henry laughed, not unkindly but dismissively. Granite isn't wood. You can't attach logs to granite. How will you secure your sidewalls to the back? With standard notching, each corner supports the others. Your design breaks that principle. William Garrett had been studying the drawings with the intensity of someone who considered himself an authority. He was the settlement's closest approximation to a professional carpenter, having built most of the family's cabins and furniture. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the weight of expertise dismissing foolishness. "Son, I've built 17 cabins in these mountains. Every one of them followed proper construction methods. 4 walls, properly notched corners, adequate roofing. What you're proposing violates basic structural principles." Elias asked what specific problems William saw. The carpenter enumerated them. First, the lack of a 4th corner eliminated critical load distribution. Second, building against a cliff face created moisture problems, as water would accumulate against the rock. Third, the overhang might provide some weather protection, but it would also create dangerous wind patterns that could damage the structure. Fourth, and most importantly, the design showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how forces worked in log construction. "You're thinking about this like a boy who watched his father's cabin fail," William said. "I understand that. But the solution isn't to abandon proven methods for something radical and untested. The solution is to build a proper cabin with adequate roof support. Your father's cabin failed because it was built quickly, not because the design was wrong. If you build correctly, with proper support beams and adequate pitch, roofs don't collapse." Other men had gathered during this conversation. Most nodded agreement with William's assessment. A few looked at Elias with pity, seeing a traumatized boy grasping at impractical ideas. Jacob Weatherly summed up the group's consensus. "Elias, we'll help you, but not with this cliff scheme. We'll help you build a real cabin, a proper structure. Pick a good site near water, and we'll get you set up correctly. You and Sarah need shelter, and we won't abandon Thomas's children. But we also won't waste time on something that won't work." Elias gathered his drawings. "The cliff will work," he said quietly. "I know it will." Elias and Sarah rode back to their lean-to shelter without the help he had sought. Sarah was quiet during the journey, processing what she had witnessed at the trading post. On the evening of their 2nd day traveling, as they sat by a small fire, she finally spoke. "Maybe they're right," she said. "Maybe we should build a regular cabin. They know more than we do." Elias stared into the flames. He understood her fear. She was 9 years old, orphaned, living in a lean-to in the middle of winter. And now, her 14-year-old brother was insisting on a construction plan that experienced men had called foolish. It would be easier to accept their help and build what they recommended. But every time he considered that option, he remembered the sound of the roof collapsing, remembered digging through snow and debris to find his parents dead. He could not build another structure with a roof he had to trust. "They're wrong," he said. "The cliff will work. I know it will." They returned to find the lean-to still standing, but barely. Elias spent 2 days reinforcing it while planning his next steps. He had the drawings, the measurements, and a clear understanding of what needed to be done. What he lacked was manpower and time. Winter was not yet over, but it would be eventually. He could begin preparation work immediately, selecting and cutting logs, clearing the cliff site, gathering materials. The actual construction would take months, but he could start. He moved their camp to the cliffside in early March. The lean-to was relocated to the protected area beneath the overhang. Sarah noticed immediately how different the environment felt. Less wind, less snow accumulation, the massive granite presence above providing psychological comfort as well as physical protection. They were still living in inadequate shelter, but the location itself felt safer. Elias began cutting trees. He worked methodically, selecting straight pines of appropriate diameter. Each tree had to be felled, trimmed, and hauled to the building site. This was work normally done by multiple men with horses or oxen. Elias had himself, Boone, and occasionally Sarah helping with smaller tasks. He rigged a dragging system using rope and a lever, allowing him to move logs that would otherwise be impossible for one person to handle. Progress was brutally slow. A good day meant moving 3 logs. Some days he managed only 1. Winter gradually released its grip. Snow melted. The creek swelled with runoff. The forest came alive with spring sounds. Elias continued working. By late April, he had 40 logs cut and positioned near the cliff site. His hands were covered in calluses and scars. His body had become leaner and stronger from the constant physical labor. Sarah had taken over all camp duties, cooking, maintaining their fire, managing their meager supplies. Travelers occasionally passed through the valley. Word had spread about the Drummond boy trying to build a cabin under a cliff. Some stopped to watch him work. Most shook their heads at what they considered wasted effort. Jacob Weatherly visited once in May, attempting again to convince Elias to abandon the project and accept help building a proper cabin. Elias thanked him politely and continued dragging logs. Elias began actual wall construction in June of 1842. The foundation work came first, something most mountain cabins completely lacked. He dug a shallow trench along the lines where his 3 walls would stand, then filled these trenches with rocks gathered from the creek bed. The rock foundation provided a level, stable base that would prevent settling and shifting. This alone separated his construction from standard methods. But Elias understood that foundations distributed weight and prevented moisture from rotting the bottom logs. The first logs went down in mid-June. Elias had stripped the bark from every log using his father's draw knife, a process that took weeks but created smooth, uniform surfaces. Bark created irregular gaps and eventually rotted, creating weakness. Stripped logs fitted together more tightly and lasted longer. He positioned the first course of logs carefully, checking level repeatedly using a simple water-filled trough he had constructed. The corner construction presented the challenge William Garrett had mentioned. Traditional cabins used notched corners where 4 walls met, each corner supporting the others. Elias's design had only 2 corners where his side walls met the front wall. The back ends of his side walls butted directly against the granite cliff face. He solved the attachment problem by drilling holes into the granite using a star drill and hammer, back-breaking work that took days for each hole. Into these holes, he drove iron pins salvaged from his father's equipment, then drilled corresponding holes in the log ends. The pins connected the logs directly to the stone, creating a rigid attachment that could not shift. The front corners used a technique Elias had observed in stone wall construction, but adapted for logs. He extended each log past the corner point by 2 feet, creating overlapping extensions. Then he drilled holes through the overlapping sections and drove wooden pins through multiple logs simultaneously. The result looked unusual, with log ends protruding from the corners, but the structure was remarkably rigid. Between each log, Elias used a mixture he had developed through experimentation. Clay from the creek bank, mixed with dried grass and pine resin he had boiled from sap. The mixture was laborious to prepare, but created chinking superior to standard mud and moss. As it dried, the grass reinforced the clay, the resin made it waterproof, and the combination bonded to the wood with surprising strength. The walls rose slowly through July and August. Where an experienced crew could build a standard cabin in days, Elias's construction was measured in weeks. But every log was placed with obsessive care. Every gap was minimized. Every connection was as strong as he could make it. Sarah helped where she could, mixing chinking, carrying water, preparing meals. Boone kept watch, alerting them to approaching animals or visitors. The work was exhausting, but the structure taking shape beneath the granite overhang was undeniably solid. The door construction began in late August, after the walls reached their full height of 7 logs, approximately 7 feet tall. Elias had salvaged hinges and metal brackets from the destroyed cabin, heavy iron hardware his father had bought in St. Louis years earlier. These pieces would be crucial for creating a door that could withstand the mountain environment and potential threats from animals or weather. He selected a large pine for the door planks, choosing wood with dense, straight grain. Using his father's saw and draw knife, he shaped 6 planks, each 3 inches thick, and fitted so tightly together that light could not pass between them. The planks were assembled using a simple tongue and groove joint, each plank interlocking with its neighbor to create what was effectively a single piece of wood. The completed door weighed perhaps 70 pounds, far heavier than standard cabin doors, but the weight provided strength. The iron brackets were mounted diagonally across the interior face, creating an X pattern that prevented warping and distributed stress across the entire door surface. Elias used nails salvaged from the old cabin, driving them through the door, through the brackets, and clinching them over on the exterior side. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the log door frame, sitting in rectangular pockets he had cut with chisel and mallet. This mounting method meant the hinges could not be torn free without destroying the logs themselves. William Garrett visited again in early September and examined the door with obvious surprise. He tested its weight, studied the hinge mounting, and ran his hand along the tight joints between planks. "This is good work," he admitted. "Better than most. But you're putting all this effort into a structure that still won't survive. That cliff face isn't a proper back wall. When winter comes and the cold settles in, you'll understand why cabins need 4 walls." Elias said nothing. He had learned that arguing was pointless. The work would speak for itself when winter arrived. The windows were placed high on the side walls, approximately 6 feet above the interior floor. Elias made them deliberately small, only 10 inches by 12 inches, and built shutters from thick planks reinforced with iron brackets matching the door construction. The shutters hinged on the interior and could be secured with wooden bars. He had salvaged oiled paper from the destroyed cabin, but instead of using it directly, he stretched canvas across each window opening and embedded it in layers of his clay resin mixture. The result was translucent, allowing diffused light while being far stronger than paper or rawhide. By mid-September, the basic structure was complete. 3 walls, a door, 2 windows, all built with care that exceeded anything Elias had attempted before. The granite cliff face rose behind it, and the massive overhang extended above, protecting everything beneath. It looked strange compared to standard cabins, but it was undeniably solid. Sarah stood beside him one evening, looking at what her brother had built. "It feels safe," she said quietly. That was enough. The interior work occupied Elias through late September and October. He built a fireplace in the corner where the front wall met the left side wall, positioning it so the chimney would run up against the granite cliff face. This placement was intentional. Stone absorbed heat during the day and radiated it at night, creating thermal mass that would help maintain stable interior temperatures. Elias gathered flat rocks from the creek and built the fireplace with careful attention to proper draft and smoke management. The chimney construction took 2 weeks. He mortared the stones with clay, building the chimney straight and narrow, extending it high enough to create good draw, but not so high that wind would create downdrafts. He included a smoke shelf partway up, a horizontal ledge that reflected heat back into the room and prevented rain from falling straight down. When he lit the first test fire, the draft worked perfectly, pulling smoke up and out while the granite wall behind the fireplace began absorbing heat. Sarah noticed the warmth immediately. Even in October, before serious cold arrived, the cabin maintained a comfortable temperature with a relatively small fire. The granite wall radiated heat for hours after the fire died down. This was something Elias had hoped for, but not guaranteed. The thermal mass effect was proving even more effective than anticipated. He built sleeping platforms along the right wall, raising them 2 feet off the dirt floor. The elevation provided storage space beneath and kept them off the cold ground. Sarah's platform was near the fireplace for maximum warmth. Elias's was closer to the door, positioning himself between any potential threat and his sister. He constructed a table using careful joinery, built shelves for supplies, and created storage areas for tools and equipment. As he worked on these interior elements, Elias calculated the material savings his design had provided. A standard cabin of similar interior space would require approximately 60 logs for 4 walls. His 3-wall design had used 42 logs. The 18 saved logs had allowed him to use thicker logs throughout, to build his walls 1 log higher than standard, and to invest extra material in the door and window shutters. Every aspect of the structure benefited from the efficiency of building only what was necessary. The roof advantage became apparent during the first heavy rain in October. Standard cabin roofs, even well-built ones, developed leaks over time. Bark shifted, sod compressed, gaps opened. Elias sat inside during a day-long rainstorm and listened to water drumming on the granite overhang 20 feet above. Not a single drop entered the cabin. The overhang shed water away from the structure completely. The interior remained perfectly dry. He also noticed the wind patterns. The overhang created a natural windbreak. Northwest winds that would hammer a freestanding cabin simply passed over the protected area beneath the cliff. The cabin walls faced less stress from wind than standard structures, and the interior stayed warmer because cold air did not penetrate gaps the way it did in conventional cabins. November brought the first serious snowfall, and Elias worked to complete the cabin's final elements before winter fully arrived. He constructed gun ports in both side walls, narrow vertical slits barely visible from the exterior but wide enough to point a rifle through from inside. These ports provided defensive capability without compromising the wall's structural integrity. He could observe approaching threats and defend the cabin without opening the door or windows. The sleeping loft for Sarah was built in the back corner, elevated 8 feet above the floor, and accessible by a sturdy ladder. The loft provided her with privacy and positioned her in the warmest part of the cabin, where heat rising from the fireplace collected. Elias built railings to prevent falls and created storage cubbies in the loft space for their limited possessions. Sarah arranged her bedding and her mother's sewing kit, creating a small personal space. Elias's own sleeping platform remained on the main floor near the door. He wanted to be the first line of response to any disturbance during the night. Boone slept near him, the dog's keen senses providing early warning of anything approaching the cabin. The arrangement worked well during test nights. The interior stayed warm, the sleeping areas were comfortable, and the thick walls blocked wind noise that might otherwise keep them awake. The final significant addition was a covered area just outside the door, where firewood could be stacked under protection from the overhang. Elias built a simple rack using leftover logs, positioning it where wood would remain dry and accessible even during heavy snow. He spent 2 weeks cutting and stacking enough firewood to last through winter, knowing that staying warm would be crucial for survival. He also created a simple drainage system around the cabin perimeter. By digging shallow trenches that directed water away from the walls, he ensured that spring snowmelt and rain would not pool against the structure. The trenches were lined with rocks and sloped away from the cabin, following the natural drainage pattern of the cliff site. This detail, invisible to casual observers, would prevent moisture damage that plagued many frontier cabins. By late November, the cabin was complete. Elias stood outside one evening, examining what 6 months of solitary work had produced. The structure looked different from any cabin in the region. The protruding corner logs, the high placement of windows, the way it nestled against the cliff face with the massive overhang above, all of it marked the design as unusual. But it was solid. Every joint was tight. Every element served a purpose. He had built exactly what he had envisioned after watching his parents die under a collapsed roof. Sarah joined him outside, Boone between them. "Do you think they were wrong?" she asked, meaning the men at the settlement who had mocked the design. "We'll know soon enough," Elias said. "Winter will tell us." They moved their supplies inside that week, stocking the cabin with everything necessary for survival through the brutal months ahead. December arrived with temperatures dropping below zero and snow beginning to accumulate in earnest. Elias and Sarah settled into their new home, establishing routines that would sustain them through winter. The cabin proved immediately superior to any shelter they had experienced. The thick walls blocked wind completely. The fireplace heated the space efficiently, and the granite thermal mass meant the interior stayed warm for hours after the fire burned low. Sarah slept comfortably in her loft, and Elias found the main floor sleeping platform adequate. The food supplies were substantial but not excessive. Elias had trapped and hunted throughout the fall, preserving meat by smoking and drying. They had cornmeal, dried beans, salt, and a small amount of coffee. Sarah had gathered and dried berries and edible plants during the summer. The supplies would last through winter if they were careful, but there was no excess. This was frontier survival, not comfortable living. Visitors arrived in early December. Jacob Weatherly and 2 other trappers stopped while traveling through the area. They examined the cabin with obvious curiosity. Jacob walked around the structure, studying the construction, looking up at the granite overhang, testing the door. His expression was skeptical but not hostile. "You actually built it," Jacob said. "I said I would," Elias replied. "It's solid work, I'll give you that. But winter hasn't really hit yet. Wait until January, February. Wait until the real cold comes and the snow piles up. That's when you'll understand why we build cabins the proper way." He gestured at the cliff face. "Stone is cold. Colder than air. It'll draw heat right out of your cabin. You'll be freezing in there while people in regular cabins stay warm." Elias did not argue. He simply invited Jacob inside to feel the temperature. The interior was comfortably warm from a modest fire. Jacob frowned, clearly surprised, but attributed it to the newness of the structure. "Wood hasn't seasoned yet," he said. "Give it time. The cold will find its way in." The other men made similar predictions. Henry Blackwood stopped by with his family a few days later. He brought Sarah a small bag of dried apples as a gift. A kind gesture, but his opinion of the cabin was unchanged. "You're brave, trying something like this," he told Elias. "But bravery doesn't keep you alive in winter. Proper construction does. You'll be begging for shelter by February." William Garrett's visit was the most pointed. He arrived alone, examined the structure with professional scrutiny, and delivered his assessment. "You've done good carpentry work, better than I expected from a boy. But you've built it in the wrong place, with the wrong design. When you come to the settlement asking for help after this experiment fails, we'll assist you. No shame in admitting a mistake." Elias thanked him politely. After William left, Sarah asked why her brother did not defend the design more forcefully. "Because the cabin will defend itself," Elias said. "When winter proves it works, they'll understand. Until then, words don't matter." They continued their preparations, cutting more firewood, checking and rechecking supplies, ensuring everything was ready for the hardest months ahead. The first heavy snow came in late December, 2 days before Christmas. The storm dropped 18 inches overnight, and Elias woke to complete silence. the kind of muffled quiet that indicated deep snow accumulation. He dressed and opened the door carefully, finding snow had drifted against it, but not blocked it completely. The area immediately in front of the cabin, protected by the overhang, had perhaps 4 inches. Beyond the overhang's protection, snow was knee-deep. He cleared a path to the firewood stack and brought in enough wood for the day. Sarah prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush while Elias fed Boone. The cabin interior was comfortable, the fire from the previous night having died to coals, but the retained heat in the granite wall keeping the temperature tolerable. He rebuilt the fire, and the space warmed quickly. Throughout the day, Elias observed the snow patterns around the cabin. The overhang was performing exactly as he had anticipated. Snow that fell onto the angled granite surface slid off naturally, accumulating beyond the protected zone. There was no buildup on the overhang itself, no weight accumulating above them. Standard cabins throughout the region were now bearing hundreds of pounds of snow on their roofs. His cabin bore none. The temperature dropped sharply that night. Elias estimated it reached 20 below zero based on how water froze and how the trees cracked from the cold. He kept the fire burning steadily, and Sarah stayed warm in her loft where the heat accumulated. The granite wall behind the fireplace was warm to the touch, even on its interior surface, confirming that the thermal mass was working as intended. The stone absorbed heat all day and released it slowly at night. January brought more storms. Each one deposited additional snow, and by mid-month, the accumulation outside the overhang's protection exceeded 3 feet. Elias had to dig pathways to reach the creek for water and to access areas for hunting. But the cabin itself remained in a relatively snow-free zone. The overhang created a protected space that stayed clear while the surrounding forest was buried. Other cabins in the region were experiencing problems. Elias heard reports from passing trappers. Roofs were sagging under snow weight. Some families were having to climb onto their roofs to shovel snow off, dangerous work in brutal cold. Leaks were developing as the weight compressed bark and sod, creating gaps.
Several cabins had suffered partial roof collapses, though fortunately no one had been killed.
The thermal mass advantage became more apparent as winter deepened. Jacob Weatherly had predicted that the stone cliff face would draw heat from the cabin, making it cold. The opposite was true. The granite absorbed heat from the fire and from whatever weak winter sun struck it during the day, then radiated that stored warmth into the cabin. The effect was subtle but measurable. The interior temperature was more stable than in standard cabins. The blizzard began on February 9, 1843, arriving with little warning. Elias had gone outside at dawn to gather firewood and noticed the sky had taken on a peculiar yellowish-gray color. The air felt heavy and still. Boone was restless, pacing near the door and whining. Animals sensed approaching storms with accuracy humans lacked, and Boone's behavior told Elias something significant was coming. He spent the morning bringing in extra firewood, stacking it inside the cabin until there was barely room to move. Sarah filled every container they owned with water from the creek. They moved all essential supplies inside and secured the door and window shutters. By noon, the first snow was falling. By mid-afternoon, the wind had risen to a howl and visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The storm intensified through the night. Wind screamed around the cliff face, creating strange resonating sounds as it passed over the overhang. Snow fell so heavily that Elias could not see beyond the cabin walls when he looked through the gun ports. The temperature plummeted. The fire roared in the fireplace, and Elias fed it constantly, knowing their survival depended on maintaining heat. Sarah stayed in her loft, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Boone lay near the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the storm. Elias dozed sitting up, keeping watch, feeding the fire, ensuring nothing went wrong. The cabin walls creaked occasionally from the wind pressure, but they held solid. No drafts penetrated the thick logs and tight chinking. The interior remained a warm refuge while the wilderness outside tried to kill anything exposed to it. The storm continued through the next day and the day after that. 3 full days of blinding snow and brutal wind. Elias lost track of time, marking days only by sleep cycles and meals. They ate sparingly, not knowing how long they might be trapped inside. The firewood supply diminished steadily, but Elias calculated they had enough to last through the storm with some despair. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The sudden silence was startling after 3 days of constant noise. Elias opened the door carefully and looked out at a transformed landscape. Snow had buried everything to a depth he estimated at 4 feet or more. Drifts in some areas were substantially higher. But the area directly beneath the overhang, where the cabin stood, had perhaps 6 inches of wind-blown powder. The contrast was dramatic. The overhang had shed the storm's accumulation continuously. Snow that landed on the angled granite surface had slid off, deposited beyond the protected zone. The cabin had weathered the worst blizzard Elias had ever experienced without accumulating any dangerous snow load. A standard cabin roof would now be bearing tons of weight. His cabin bore nothing. He stepped outside with Boone and surveyed the valley. The forest was buried. Individual trees looked like white pillars. Small structures or cabins would be nearly invisible under the accumulation. He thought about the settlement 2 days south and wondered how they had fared. News of the devastation reached Elias a week after the blizzard, when a trapper named Thomas Reed passed through the valley. Reed was traveling north from the settlement and stopped at the cliff cabin, having heard about the unusual structure. He was exhausted, traveling through deep snow, and Elias offered him food and a place to rest. Reed told him what had happened. The blizzard had devastated the settlement. 6 cabins had suffered complete or partial roof collapses. Jacob Weatherly's cabin roof had failed on the 2nd night of the storm, the center section dropping inward under the snow weight. Jacob and his wife had survived by huddling in a corner, but their cabin was uninhabitable. They were now staying with Henry Blackwood, whose cabin had held but was showing dangerous signs of stress. William Garrett's carpentry workshop had collapsed entirely on the 3rd day. The building, which housed his tools and supplies, was destroyed. Garrett had not been inside when it happened, but he had lost most of his equipment and materials. His living cabin had survived, but barely. He had been forced to climb onto the roof during the storm's worst moments to shovel snow, risking his life to prevent collapse. Other families had similar stories. The Morrison family's cabin developed a major leak that flooded their interior with melting snow. The Patterson family's roof sagged so severely they had evacuated and were sheltering with neighbors. Throughout the settlement, people were either repairing damage, living in overcrowded conditions with others, or facing the prospect of rebuilding. Reed looked around Elias's cabin with obvious amazement. "You've got maybe 6 inches of snow outside your door," he said. "We've got 4 feet everywhere else. How is this possible?" Elias explained the overhang's effect, how the angled granite shed snow naturally. Reed walked outside and studied the formation, looking up at the massive rock projection. "They said you were crazy for building here," he said. "Jacob told everyone you'd be dead by spring. I guess he was wrong." Reed stayed one night, then continued north. Before leaving, he told Elias that conditions at the settlement were desperate. Food was running low because people could not travel to hunt or check trap lines. Firewood was becoming scarce because reaching the forest required digging through massive drifts. Several families were considering abandoning their damaged cabins and relocating, though where they would go or how they would survive was unclear. Elias and Sarah discussed what to do. They had enough supplies for themselves, but not enough to help an entire settlement. Going south to offer assistance meant risking their own survival. But Elias remembered how his father had helped neighbors when they needed it. That was frontier code, unwritten but understood. You helped when you could. Before he could decide, the decision was made for him. 2 days after Reed's departure, Elias heard voices approaching the cabin. He looked out to see Daniel Marsh struggling through the snow, supporting his pregnant wife, Emma. They were both exhausted and freezing. Daniel had wrapped Emma in blankets, but the journey had been brutal. Daniel Marsh collapsed near the cabin door, barely able to stand. Elias helped him inside while Sarah assisted Emma, who was shaking from cold and exhaustion. They positioned both near the fireplace immediately. Elias built up the fire while Sarah brought warm water and food. Boone watched from a corner, sensing the tension. It took nearly an hour before Daniel could speak coherently. His cabin had been damaged during the blizzard, not collapsed but compromised enough that cold was penetrating. Emma was 7 months pregnant, and Daniel had become terrified she would not survive in the inadequate shelter. He had heard about Elias's cliff cabin from Thomas Reed and made the desperate decision to travel north despite the dangerous conditions. "I know we mocked you," Daniel said, his voice shaking from more than just cold. "I was at the trading post when you showed your drawings. I laughed along with the others. I'm sorry, we were wrong. Can we stay here? Just until I can figure out something else? Emma needs warmth. The baby needs her to survive." Elias looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "You can stay," Elias said. "We'll make room." Daniel and Emma took Elias's sleeping platform while he moved to sleeping near the fireplace on the floor. The cabin was crowded with 4 people and a dog, but it was manageable. Emma's health improved quickly in the warm environment. The color returned to her face, and she stopped shaking. Daniel helped with daily tasks, cutting firewood and hauling water, working to earn their keep. 3 days later, Jacob Weatherly arrived. He came alone, walking slowly through the snow, looking older than his 42 years. He stood outside the cabin without knocking, and Elias found him there, staring at the structure. Jacob's cabin was uninhabitable, and he had been crowded into Henry Blackwood's damaged structure with multiple families. The conditions were miserable. "I need to ask something I have no right to ask," Jacob said. "Can I shelter here? I'll work. I'll help however you need. But I can't stay where I am. It's killing me slowly." Elias let him in. The cabin was now seriously crowded, but they managed. Jacob took a corner near the door, insisting he would not displace anyone else. He was humbled and quiet, a stark change from the confident man who had dismissed Elias's design months earlier. More arrived over the next week. Henry Blackwood came with his 2 children, his wife having gone to stay with relatives in a more distant settlement. William Garrett arrived, the expert carpenter who had explained why the cliff cabin would fail. Each arrival was similar. Exhausted people, desperate for warmth and safety, begging for shelter in the structure they had ridiculed. Elias accepted them all. The cabin became seriously overcrowded with 12 people, but it held. The fireplace provided enough heat. The supplies stretched thin but lasted. The granite wall continued radiating warmth, and the overhang continued shedding snow that would have crushed any standard roof. The 12 people living in the cliff cabin established routines by necessity. Space was limited, privacy was non-existent, but survival created cooperation. Men took turns gathering firewood and hauling water. Women managed cooking and care for Emma, whose pregnancy advanced steadily. Children helped with smaller tasks. Elias, despite being the youngest adult present, was deferred to as the cabin's builder and owner. His authority was unspoken but absolute. The crowded conditions revealed the design's true strengths. A standard cabin housing 12 people would have been unbearably cold, the heat from a single fireplace insufficient to warm the space. Elias's cabin remained comfortable. The thermal mass effect from the granite wall distributed heat throughout the interior. The thick walls eliminated drafts. The tight chinking prevented cold air infiltration. People who had spent months in conventional cabins noticed the difference immediately. William Garrett studied the construction obsessively during the long winter days. He examined the corner joints where logs extended past the intersection point, creating the overlapping pattern Elias had designed. He tested the chinking mixture, noting its strength and flexibility. He looked at how the side walls connected to the granite cliff face through drilled pins. He climbed outside to study the overhang's geometry and how it shed snow. One evening, William asked detailed questions about the construction process. How long had it taken? What tools had been required? How had Elias determined the measurements? The carpenter listened carefully to every answer, occasionally nodding, sometimes asking for clarification. Finally, he spoke what everyone else was thinking. "I've built 17 cabins in these mountains," William said. "Every one of them followed methods I learned from my father and grandfather. Proven techniques passed down through generations. And every one of them was inferior to what a 14-year-old boy designed by himself. I don't know whether to be ashamed or impressed." Jacob Weatherly added his own assessment. "I told you that rock would draw heat from the cabin. I was wrong. I told you 3 walls wouldn't provide adequate structure. I was wrong. I told you the overhang might collapse. Wrong again. Everything I said about this design was incorrect." Henry Blackwood spoke more gently. "You tried to show us something better, and we dismissed it because it came from a boy. That was foolish pride. You saved our lives by building this despite our mockery. We owe you more than we can repay." Elias was uncomfortable with the praise. He had not built the cabin to prove anyone wrong or to gain recognition. He had built it because he watched his parents die under a collapsed roof and could not bear to trust another standard design. The validation was satisfying, but it was secondary to the simple fact that the structure worked. Emma gave birth in late March to a healthy daughter. The cabin that sheltered 12 through the worst of winter became a place where new life began, warm and safe beneath ancient stone. Spring arrived slowly, snow melting gradually through April and May. As travel became possible, the family sheltering in Elias's cabin began returning to the settlement to assess damage and begin repairs. Daniel and Emma left first with their infant daughter, thanking Elias repeatedly. Jacob departed next, planning to rebuild his cabin. Henry Blackwood and his children followed. William Garrett was last to leave, spending extra time taking measurements and making detailed drawings of the cliff cabin's construction. Before William left, he asked permission to share the design with others. Elias agreed without hesitation. He had never considered the techniques proprietary. If they could help people survive, they should be used freely. William promised to give credit to Elias whenever he built using the methods, but Elias told him that was unnecessary. The work would speak for itself. By summer of 1843, 3 families in the settlement were building cabins against cliff faces or large rock formations. William Garrett supervised the construction, teaching the methods Elias had developed. The designs varied based on available rock formations, but the principles remained consistent. Use natural stone for roofs when possible. Build only necessary walls. Create thermal mass for heat retention. Invest saved materials into stronger construction of remaining elements. The technique spread organically over the following years. Trappers traveling through the region saw the cliff-back cabins and understood their advantages. Some tried building their own versions. Settlers moving west heard about the design and sought out appropriate sites. By 1848, perhaps 24 structures across Montana and Wyoming incorporated elements of what people were calling Bridger-style construction, though Elias's name was actually Drummond, and most builders did not know who had originated the techniques. Elias and Sarah lived quietly in their cliff cabin through 1843 and into 1844. Elias trapped and hunted, building modest savings. Sarah grew into a capable young woman who managed their household and eventually taught herself to read using a Bible William Garrett had given her. Boone aged alongside them, still alert but moving slower. In 1845, Elias met a woman named Catherine at the settlement. She was the daughter of new settlers, 19 years old, practical and strong. They married in 1846. Catherine moved into the cliff cabin and adapted immediately to its unusual design. She appreciated the warmth, the stability, the way it felt protected rather than exposed. Elias never sought recognition for his innovation. When travelers asked about the cabin's construction, he answered their questions but did not promote himself. He had solved a problem that needed solving, using materials and techniques available to anyone willing to invest the effort. The fact that others benefited was satisfying, but it was not why he had built it. Sarah married in 1849 and moved to Oregon with her husband. Elias and Catherine eventually followed in 1852, leaving the cliff cabin to new occupants who maintained it for decades. The structure stood for more than 40 years before finally being abandoned, outlasting every standard cabin built in the same era. Elias died in 1881 at age 53 in Oregon, having lived a quiet life far from the mountains where he had innovated out of necessity and grief. But across Montana, Wyoming, and beyond, cabins built against stone were still being constructed using principles a 14-year-old boy had developed after watching his parents die under a collapsed roof.